Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to my salon. This is Mental Floss on YouTube. And did you know that the word lemur comes from a Latin word meaning spirits of the dead? Carl Linnaeus, who named the animal, said, "I call them lemurs because they go around mainly by night in a certain way similar to humans and roam with a slow pace." So they're basically zombies then. And that's the first of many word origins I'm going to share with you today. Mussel comes from the Latin root for little mouse, because back in the 14th century, people thought that mussels looked like mice living under their skin. Pfft, obviously they never saw my guns. How do you say fat honey badger in Latin? In the 12th century, a Latin love poem became very popular in Europe. It was copied many times and passed from person to person. The poem was titled Pamphilus, giving us the word for pamphlet. Yankee started with the Dutch, who lived in New York during the 1600s, when it was called New Amsterdam. Though the details can't be confirmed, the word is probably a combination of two Dutch names, Jan and Kees. This was either an insult that the English colonists called the Dutch, or the other way around. The meaning switched and became a positive word for American, unless you're a Southerner. Hippocampus is the Greek word for a horse-fish hybrid. In classic mythology, these monsters were associated with Neptune. The hippocampus in your brain apparently looks like those sea creatures, which I guess means the hippocampus looks something like this. The word berserk comes from ancient Norse fighters, also known as berserkers. The original term came from the Norse words bear and shirt, which is what the berserkers wore. Salmon comes from the Latin word salmo, or to leap. The origin of ketchup is hotly debated, but many people believe it came from China. The ancient Chinese used a similar word for the brine that they used to pickle fish, which is connected to ketchup in that they are both liquid-like, food-like phenomena. Another controversial term is kibosh, though most claim it can be traced back to Ireland, where a similar sounding term referred to the so-called cap of death, the hat that a judge would wear when sentencing someone to death. In the 13th century, the French used the expression mortgage, meaning death pledge. This term gave us the word mortgage. Aloof came from an English term in the 1500s for weather gauge. The English borrowed this root from the Dutch word loof, which meant the windward side of a ship. What does any of that have to do with being aloof? Ever wonder why English is the only language in the world that uses pineapple rather than some form of ananas? Pineapple used to be a word for pine cone, which is what the fruit looked like to early explorers, who were apparently blind. While we're talking about fruit, the word cantaloupe emerged in the 18th century. It's named after its place of origin, Cantalupo, Italy. The town's name literally translates to singing wolf. Mayonnaise is another food named after a place. The French captured the island of Minorca during the 7 Years' War, a victory that was apparently celebrated with the condiment. The island's capital is Port Mahon, and the suffix "ase" means native to. But of course, the joke was on the French. Sure, they won Minorca, but then they had to have mayonnaise. War has been in the English language since the 11th century. It actually comes from a Germanic root that meant to confuse, which is kind of confusing. In Greek, kynikos was a term for followers of the philosopher Antisthenes, but the literal translation is dog-like. Anyway, that gave us the word cynic. The word dunce is also a reference to philosophy. John Duns Scotus was a philosopher whose teachings were largely religious and influenced the Catholic Church. His followers were called dunces. Later philosophers weren't so impressed with his work, so dunce took on a negative connotation. Lukewarm is a tautology. Luke meant warm in Middle English, so when we say lukewarm, we're saying warm. Heresy comes from Greek. It meant choice. Apprehend emerged in the 1300s from the Latin word apprehendere, which meant to grasp. So when you apprehend, you are grasping meaning, or grasping someone in arrest. Jumbo probably was originally the word for elephant in a West African language. The word took on the meaning of large when an elephant in the London Zoo was named Jumbo in the 1860s. Which makes me dream of a world in which we actually had jumbo shrimp. In Old English, WYRD meant fate. Weirdly, that gave us the term weird. Ancient Romans who were running for office wore white, so the Latin word for white-robed gave us the term candidate. The fabric denim originally appeared in Nimes, France, so it was first called serge de Nimes, or fabric from Nimes, but the serge soon disappeared, leaving us just with denim. Similarly, jeans were named after their place of origin, Genoa, Italy. The French word for Genoa is jeans, or possibly gens. As you might have guessed, I don't speak French. Nice comes from the Latin word for ignorant. So maybe that's why nice guys finish last. Curfew is a combination of two French words, couvrir, to cover, and feu, fire. So curfew literally means to cover fire. Noon comes from the Latin nona hora, meaning ninth hour. In ancient Rome, noon was actually around 3 p.m. During the 12th and 13th centuries, noon slowly moved back to, noon. Presumably this change was driven by people wanting to eat lunch earlier. Bankrupt is from the Italian term banca rota, literally meaning broken bench. In Old English, knight originally meant boy or servant. Now, of course, it means a bad pun in a Tom Cruise movie title. Night and Day? Anybody? No? I'm the only person who saw that? I think I might literally be the only person who saw that. Let's face it, Tom Cruise didn't even see that Tom Cruise movie. Anyway, the Old English word for worm, spelled W-U-R-M, gave us the word worm, but that word came from another Old English word meaning serpent or dragon, which makes me wonder, how big were worms in medieval Europe? The word money emerged in Rome because of the temple of Juno Minetta, which reminds me. There's a link in the description so you can redeem your Shroot Bucks for Mental Floss t-shirts. Shroot Bucks, the only currency that Mark and Meredith are ever paid in. Anyway, the ancient Romans used that temple as a mint because she was a goddess associated with money. Moneta came to mean mint, and then money. Escape came from the Latin ex, meaning out, and cappa, meaning cloak. The literal meaning probably comes from the idea that if a person was being pursued, they would disappear, leaving only their cloak behind. The Latin word for walking is ambulant, which resulted in ambulance. Ambulance first meant like a moving hospital before it became a specific term. The word didn't refer to an actual wagon carrying the wounded until the Crimean War in the 1850s. Also in the 19th century, Americans borrowed the word promenade, which referred to a formal walk that would occur at balls, and was shortened to prom. Lobster comes from a Latin word that also means locust. That is disgusting. Nostril is a combination of the Old English words for nose and hole. In the 13th century, the French gave us the meaning of cider that we use, but the original term that it derived from meant strong or alcoholic drink. Ancient Romans gave us senator, but before the word had its current meaning, it came from a word for old, and in fact is a relative of the word senile. I'm not surprised. Thanks for watching Mental Floss here on YouTube, which is made with the help of all of these nice people. Every week, we endeavor to answer one of your mind-blowing questions. This week's question comes from Ross Montgomery, who asks, where does the term hearse, as in, funerals, come from? Thanks, Ross. Now I get to talk about another word origin. Hearse comes from the Oscan term for wolf, but by the 13th century, it had become a term for decorative candles or a canopy over a coffin. How? I don't know, maybe people draped wolves over their coffins. Anyway, eventually the meaning transformed into the hearse that we know today. Thanks again for watching Mental Floss, which by the way is not just a YouTube series, it's also a real-life magazine and a store where you can buy great t-shirts like this one, and if you use the code YouTubeFlossers, you get 15% off. As we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.